Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we want to talk about squatting and more specifically a beginner's guide to what a perfect squat would look like, or a perfect squat in the context of physical therapy, normal function, injury prevention, rehabilitation, all those sorts of things. So there's obviously a number of different types of squats. They can be used to varying degrees to achieve different things. But the shape or the archetype should be the same. There should be a common theme that runs through most of those squats. And unfortunately, through social media, just through people's experiences, we often have these differing opinions or different ideas of what a good squat looks like. Often it comes back to sort of where your feet should be pointing, what depth is correct, what your hips, what your back should be doing, how wide apart your feet should be. There's all these different variables that sort of give people sort of means to be in different areas, speaking about the squat in different ways. But ultimately, as human beings, we all have the same anatomy, give or take. And that anatomy has an ideal function that if we can optimize that function, if you have pain, then it's a really, really good opportunity to tighten the screws on the way you move, to decrease the chances of that lingering. If you don't have pain and dysfunction and you just want to move better as a human being, or if you want to perform better as an athlete, it's really important that you can master this shape. Because if you can't, then you're leaving performance and athletic potential on the table. Also, on top of this, when we're going through the deep squat in a second, or go through a squat in a second, if you can't do any of this, it's not necessarily a bad thing. What it is, it's just a window into how you are at the moment. So if you witness any of the things that we'll talk about in a minute, it just gives you something to focus on to get better. So it doesn't mean that you can't do it, it just means that you can't do it right now. Because what we know, just to give some context, is that we can always look to our children, we can look to our kids quite a lot to understand some various layers of what normal is. And most people would understand that when we look at children squatting, most kids can squat fantastically well. Their bum's on the ground almost. More often than not, their feet are straight. And they can just exist there for ages. That's just how they interact with the ground. And as human beings, that's actually how we are supposed to interact with the ground. With seats and couches and chairs, we've designed those. We've deemed those important, and the issue around that, which a lot of people are now realizing, is that being stuck in a sitting position for a long time starts to rob us of hip flexibility, hip strength, back flexibility, back strength, all these sorts of things that are crucial to being a normal human. So relating this back to a good squat technique, if you're someone who hasn't had a deep experience with squatting before, hopefully this will be very useful for you. But further to that, if you're someone who feels like you are pretty good at squatting, or you squat quite a lot, it's really important to measure up how you do your squat with what we're about to go through. Because if you can do it really well, then that's fantastic. But if you feel like it's not quite the same as the way you think about it, or it's not quite the same as the way that you do it, then there might be a subtle difference there that you can undo and work towards getting better at, and then hopefully see some improvements on what you're already doing, whatever high level that might be. So how we're going to do this is I'll stand up in a second. Hopefully the camera picks this up, but I'll do a couple of squats, and we'll talk about sort of what that looks like and what the expectations are. So hopefully you can still hear me from back here. But previously in a video that went up on the channel a little bit of time ago, we talked about the value of foot positioning in walking and standing. And just to recap on that, we know that having your feet straight is functionally much better for the entire function of your leg, because when you're walking, we want to walk in more of a linear pattern where the weight goes through the middle of your foot as you push off. However, when we start to turn our feet out, what happens is we start to walk through the big toe and the arch of the foot. And then obviously normal mechanics are altered, and then over time those issues, or we can create issues through the tissues in our entire leg. And it's a similar sort of a concept with a squat, because obviously walking and standing uses the same anatomy as squatting. It's the same legs. So what we want to do is, in an ideal world, we want to have our feet parallel. In terms of the width, a shoulder width apart is fine. The key to a good squat is mobile ankles. So if you do have some ankle stiffness, you might find that having your feet wider apart will make things easier. You'll also find that if you turn your feet out a little bit, that'll also be easier because that'll help you get around some of that stiffness. But we want you to be as straight as you feel you can be for the purposes of this exercise. Now, the second point that we want to talk about here is we want to make sure that when your feet are straight, that you feel like you're screwing your feet into the ground. And what that looks like basically is with your knees and from your hips, you want to imagine that you're rotating your legs outwards. So your knees are rotating outwards without your foot wanting to join it. So essentially those feet stay straight, and then you want to imagine that you're screwing your legs into your feet essentially. And what you should feel is that if you have your hands on your bottom, when you do that, if you dig your fingers in, you should feel like the muscles in your glutes activate. This is because the musculature and the anatomy of the hip, when you externally rotate your leg on a fixed foot, it creates this stability and this tension in your hip that allows for better function. So what we find is if you feel like your feet are turned out and you try and do the same thing, it's much harder to develop the same amount of strength, the same amount of torque at the hip to stabilize. So functionally and mechanically, you can't generate as much power or as much force with your feet turned out as you can with your feet straight. So points 1 and 2, foot straight, knees rotated out as far as you feel comfortable without your toes, without your big toe, without your feet lifting up off the ground. We want to stay nice and flat, sort of the weight in between the ball of your foot and the heel, and screw those legs into your feet. And the reason why this is important and how this looks functionally is when you start to squat down, what you should notice is that your knees are out relative to your feet. So as we squat down to a certain depth, you'll see that the knees should actually travel out. They shouldn't track inwards, they should travel out and stay out. So this almost sort of flies in the face of what we see or what's been taught for a long time, where the knee, we often talk about the knee tracking over the middle of the foot. So the idea behind this is correct. We want to have some stability or some idea of where the ideal knee position should be relative to the foot. But if we're trying to make this the optimal squat, what should actually happen is that knee should track out as far as you can physically go without your foot disengaging with the ground. Because this is really important, because if you're only just sort of mid foot, this isn't really a stable position. It's not a position where you can stop those knees from wobbling. If you run into a position where you're lifting some heavy weight, or you're running and cutting, or you're jumping and twisting, this is still not a very stable position to be in. So if you're at the limits of your range of motion, all of a sudden you found this stable platform to push off from, and a stable platform to accept the most weight, develop the most power, and give yourself the best performance. So we're looking at this from a functional perspective. Those knees want to be out as far as you feel comfortable. And again, it engages the glutes as you do that. So with those key points to start with, your feet straight, legs screwed in, and as your legs come down, the next step is just to drop down as far as you feel your range of motion allows. Before you feel like your heels come up, you feel like your feet turn out, you feel like your knees start to wobble inwards, or you feel like you have to round your back. So in a perfect world, we want to be relatively straight, and we want to make sure that your feet are straight and your knees are out in that capacity. So when we're looking at a squat technique, there's some of the really important features to remember. If you can't do those, or if you can't get down to full depth, I don't know if you noticed with me, but as I got right down to the bottom, I have to lift my heels up a little bit to maintain a good spinal shape. So I have some residual ankle stiffness from a previous life of heeled shoes and supportive shoes and all the things that we used before we knew better. And I'm still dealing with that legacy myself. So when we're looking to learn from these experiences and how we can relate this to normal function, if you can keep thinking about feet straight, knees out via that rotational sort of hip stability, Um, the depth is dictated by your flexibility. So the old myth, I guess, of squatting below parallel being bad for your hips, it's actually not true. Squatting below parallel is essential for normal hip function because it's just an expression of full hip range of motion, full knee range of motion, and full ankle range of motion. So if you're missing any of those, squatting below parallel or below 90 degrees, it may not feel fantastic. But that's not because you're not supposed to do it, it's because you can't quite do it at the moment. So the more mobility that you can regain in those tissues, and we'll cover some really simple exercises to free up these tissues and make that squat easier in future episodes. But it's really important just to understand that those basic concepts are important for normal squatting. So once you can practice that squat, if you can do sets of 10, sets of 15, sets of 20, just working at your comfortable depth and not allowing your body to cheat by letting your feet turn out, your heels come up, your knees cave in. Keep that very specific shape as often as you can for as long as you can. Devote some time to do that as an exercise to practice that technique. But more importantly, try and adopt that pattern day to day. So if you're walking around the house and you need to pick up a piece of clothing from the ground, try and do it in a way that mimics normal function. So just practice that position, and then you can start to generate more and more repetitions of the same thing. And then in no time, what you'll find is that position, that technique becomes easier, more normal, and a lot simpler to do. It becomes a habit by nature. So if you can give that a go, as you said at the start of the video, if you're looking to learn how to squat for the first time, those basic concepts are very important to take with you. If you're someone who feels like you've got a bit more knowledge and you've had a history of squatting and you feel like you've got some good practice or some high practice behind you, just make sure that you can refine your squat to look like that if it isn't already, because you might be missing something. Now there's always a lot of debate about whether your feet have to be straight or your feet have to turn out. This isn't necessarily a discussion about that today, even though we're covering it. But what we know is that functionally and from an injury prevention perspective, having your feet straight and be able to drag your knees out or drive your knees out and keep them there has a significant role to play in injury prevention, because if you can't do that, then you're missing normal function. So it's okay if you don't choose to do that day to day, but you have to be able to do it when called upon. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for failure at some point, or potentially setting yourself up for failure at some point. So there's just a few tips on how that ideal squat should look, just a beginner's guide. If you have any questions, please let us know below. Please consider subscribing to the channel. We've got plans to pump out a lot more content just to help you guys in these sort of moments, to give you some access to information that you may not necessarily get otherwise. Again, all the stuff that we talk about in these videos, they're things that we talk about with our patients every day. This is real world conversations, information that we're covering a lot that's highly relevant and highly helpful. So if you have an issue, whether it's your aches and pains, whether you just want to get better as an athlete, if you can master these basic ideas, then you're a larger the way down the track to conquering those issues. So obviously, please let us know. Comment down below. Let us know what type of squats you do prefer. And then until next time, we'll see you soon.